Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Pen World Voices Festival, the Literary Mews, and of course to our panel discussion, The Impossible Exile, Stefan Zweig at the End of the World. We are very, very thrilled to be part of the festival, to be part of the Mews together with our other good friends here at NYU, and we are very thrilled to be able to present this panel on George Prochnik's new book, The Impossible Exile, with Eric Jarosinski and, of course, also Ruth Franklin participating. Eric Jarosinski teaches German literature and culture at the University of Pennsylvania. He will, however, soon be leaving academia to devote himself full-time to his post as editor of Nein.Quarterly. And if you don't know Nein.Quarterly yet, check it out. It's great. I follow it religiously, and I don't follow anything else religiously. So, a highly respected and non-existent journal of utopian negation found on Twitter and in the German weekly Die Zeit. He's currently writing occasional articles for a number of German publications and completing his first book, guess what? Nein, a manifesto, to be published next year by Fischer in Germany and Lebowski Books in the Netherlands. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
I first became familiar with Zweig when he was recommended to me by a therapist years ago that I should read Ungeduld des Herzens, the impatient heart. We're not sure exactly how it's translated, but evidently as a young man I had a rather impatient heart. From there he moved on to prescribing Nietzsche and later Prozac. But true story, but Zweig was the most enjoyable and perhaps the fewest side effects. But in any case, I very much enjoyed reading George's book, and I'm very happy to be here. And I wanted to introduce our panelists here today. Ruth Franklin is a book critic and contributing editor at the New Republic, which I believe is in fact an existent publication as opposed to my own. She's written for many publications, including The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and the New York Times Book Review, and is the recipient of a 2012 Guggenheim Fellowship, the 2012 Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism, and a 2012-2013 Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library. Currently, she is working on a biography of the American writer Shirley Jackson to be published by Norton in 2016. And I think we'll probably get around to talking a bit about the writing of biographies in our conversation today. George Prochnik, his essays, poetry, and fiction have appeared in numerous journals. He has taught English and American literature at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, is editor-at-large for Cabinet Magazine, and is the author of In Pursuit of Silence, Listening for Meaning in a World of Noise, and Putnam Camp's Sigmund Freud, James Jackson Putnam, and the Purpose of American Psychology. He works on a wide range of topics, and his writing has appeared in numerous publications, also including the New York Times and the Boston Globe. I wanted to start, actually, one of the things that I liked most in The Impossible Exile were, in fact, not only the story of Zweig's travels and his circulation and the many dilemmas and complications that he faced in his years in exile, and how masterfully I thought that was depicted in George's book, but also the stories and the jokes that circulated at the same time. In fact, one that I found particularly telling is one I wanted to read to you briefly that I think speaks to a number of the issues we might get to today. This is from the chapter Global Roulette, and it goes as the following. A story circulating among the exiles told of a Jewish-looking gentleman spotted in a travel agency in Bremen just before all hell broke loose. He was planted before a large globe, apparently undecided about where to emigrate to. The man moved his finger round and round the globe, pausing for a moment on Australia, remaining a little longer above South Africa, revolving on to Shanghai, then spinning all the way around again. At last, he showed the globe away in misery, shoved the globe away in misery, and asked the clerk, "Look here, haven't you got anything else?" And I love this for many reasons, but the first thing I wanted to ask about really was the question of, the title book is Stefan Zweig at the End of the World, but I'm also wondering about what ways we're talking about an end of a certain world and the beginning of another, because one of the things I found most interesting, compelling, and challenging about this biography is that it's a biography of so much more than one writer. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the main strands that you were trying to bring together here in Stefan Zweig's life.
Sure, thank you. It seemed to me impossible to approach Stefan Zweig's these years of exile in a traditional biographical linear format. And this is in part because he himself, in the last years of his life, clearly all sorts of time zones were simultaneously being crossed in his mind as much as he was crossing literal geographical zones. He was cycling between the past and speculations about possible future and within the present. He seemed to be everywhere at once, at times in his life literally, and psychologically really, I would say, throughout the period of his greatest success, when he was already beginning in the mid-20s, impatient with life in Austria. He'd always been a great traveler, but began to travel more and more. Clearly a restlessness that had as much to do with, as he himself said of travel, we travel not just out of love for far-off places, but also out of a desire to be remote from our location, to be someone else. And I think that this took hold of him more and more, so that he was a voluntary nomad for maybe the decade prior to initially going into exile, which began for him preemptorily in 1934 when he made the decision to leave Salzburg for a number of reasons that we can get into if you'd like or not, and went to England. And from England, he went to ultimately to New York and surprisingly Ossining, where he wrote the first draft of The World of Yesterday, which is still to me a somehow disruptive idea in everything that we associate with Stefan Zweig, especially if one goes and sees the little bungalow that he lived in, which is dreary, and everyone who visited just said, "This is a bad idea for you to be here." He became pathologically depressed by his own admission, but also was someone who, as he wrote his American publisher, was fed by that depression in terms of his ability to write. He was writing sometimes more than 70 pages a week, 400 pages in the course of roughly 2 months. So he was one of the fortunate ones in that way with his depression, that it didn't slow him down, but the reverse. I came to think about Stefan Zweig as a biographical subject very slowly, and in fact, a bit like Eric, not through any traditional literary channel. I had, in fact, not read a word of Stefan Zweig, although my father is Viennese. Growing up, I hadn't heard of him. And I came upon him as an adult when I was researching a book on Brazil, a project about Brazil, and just sort of yanked every book that I could find on Brazil off the shelf at the New York Public Library. And Brazil, Land of the Future, Zweig's book on the country that he wrote in the mid-1930s, really grabbed me. And it grabbed me because it was a hybrid work. It mixed travelogue and memoir and interesting historical anecdote. I liked its jaunty tone. I was also very impressed from the beginning with something surprisingly self-effacing. He, at the outset of this book, Zweig says, "I came to Brazil for the first time." He'd gone there on a lecture tour in the mid-1930s. "I came with all of the arrogance of the typical European, thinking I was going to a swampy backwater, a place fit only for adventurers, not somewhere that could possibly have any kind of native culture worth exploring." He was immediately struck both by the development of culture in a traditional European sense in Brazil, and even beyond this, he felt that Brazil presented a kind of cultural efflorescence that Europe had patently failed at developing. He was struck by what he saw as the racial tolerance above all. And while he idealized that to an extent, if we imagine what it was like coming from Germany or Austria in the mid-1930s and being in a city like Rio or Sao Paulo and seeing people of different color, mixed races, holding hands, freely consorting in any fashion, I think we have to credit him with seeing something that at least was not just superficial. And he felt that what Brazil had done with regard to nurturing the humane values and the values of tolerance that had been his own life interest in promulgating in Europe was in fact, a model for Europe to look at. And he goes even further and questions the whole trajectory of the development of European culture and says, we felt that culture was something essentially that could be measured by the science of statistics. What numbers of productivity, of different kinds of conveniences you could point to as a sign of your success as a culture. But he says now we've learned that all of this can coexist with absolute bestiality. So he looks to Brazil, in fact, for the model of what the world can become as a whole, at that point already in the mid-30s. So I found something remarkable in this and a way of thinking that seemed prescient at the point that Zweig wrote it. And I kept circling back to different works of fiction and different number of his biographical studies, a number of histories, and kept finding myself drawn into certain works. Other works I found, frankly, schlocky. And his character, though, kept, in my mind, becoming more complicated and more worthy of study. And he seemed to touch so many different strands of European intellectual history, of European hopes, his dedication to the idea of pan-Europeanism, pacifism, humanism, these values which part of him, they were at least as important as his dedication to his fiction in his own mind, and at some moments even more important. And it was the loss of that, in fact, that project, that pan-European project that I think was really the death blow for his own sense of of meaning in life. That's a rambling, appropriately, hopelessly.
George, I found it really charming to read in your book that you came to Zweig by way of this kind of random book about Brazil, which I had read a little bit of Zweig's fiction. I never even heard of this book about Brazil. And you say that it's sort of a travelogue, that it's a hybrid book, sort of a travelogue, sort of a memoir, sort of a history. And I wondered if you took that, either implicitly or explicitly as a kind of model for how you wanted to write this book. And then also, since you brought up Ossining, the theme of literary pilgrimage kind of runs through your book. You have this wonderful anecdote about visiting the depressing little house in Ossining and confronting the woman who lives there, who is tired of Zweig fan travelers showing up and asking her where he put his desk and what he saw at the window and all that, which I found hilarious and such a great example of how the things we imagine for our literary paragons often aren't the way they turn out to be in reality. But I wondered if you could say something about the idea of what it means to make these sorts of literary pilgrimages and what you find out about your subject that way.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a very bracing conversation early on in my research with this woman. She was in a way quite wonderful. At that point, she was very elderly then, and I think she's unfortunately become ill since that point. But she didn't let me in the house. At that point, there were all sorts of strange decals over all the windows. I think some of those have been cleaned away, but "Beware of occupants" was the one that really sticks in my mind. There were also various allusions to dragons and mythical beasts. But she confronted me. There was a Dutch door, and she kept her screen door locked, and she opened the top half of her Dutch door. And she just stared at me and said, why would you want to come in here? What can it possibly offer? I can't point you to any of the actual things. You're not going to have that mythic moment of contact, that strange frisson, and I'm interested whether this is something that also is something you're seeking in your own, ever look for with your own biography in progress on Shirley Jackson. But, I feel strongly that I wasn't, in the end, ever drawn to any one particular relic. I think that can get creepy or difficult, if not creepy. But I did find that travel to all of these locations was absolutely integral to the process of writing this book. And in fact, what I tried to do was to immerse myself in as dense a kind of web of objects and literary works and newspaper readings and sounds and studies of landscape as I could, in the hopes that maybe if I took a grab bag of what I could find and discover and read about, that some of it would rub off and give me some sensibility that was correlative to what Zweig might have felt in different places, and what would make him come to life. You know, after this discovery of him with the Brazil book, I began speaking with different friends of mine, very educated friends in complet departments, etc., about Zweig, and I just couldn't find anyone who knew anything about him. It's changed a little bit in subsequent years, but I couldn't find one person, and I just was amazed by that disappearance, and it again argued, it made me chary of approaching him as a traditional biographical subject, because who cared? I felt Zweig identified himself with Europe as a continent and as a project. There's a remarkable interview that he gave in New York in, I believe, 1935 to an interesting journalist, in which Zweig began speaking about the division of the continent into borders that required documentation to be crossed even after the First World War, and how all of these prescriptions on travel had become even more ferocious, obviously, in the subsequent years. And this reporter, Joseph Brainin, said that he had this feeling, like when Zweig was speaking about the slice and dicing of Europe, that he was seeing Zweig physically dismembered, that he had just a remarkable degree of identification with the sweep of the continent. So if I thought that to restore Zweig at all to people's attention, it was going to be necessary to try to restore some of those strands of history around him as well. It couldn't be done, I didn't think, by me at least, just taking him as an isolate subject. It was very important to bring back as much of the world of individuals and of geographical locations that he inhabited.
I actually wanted to point to another example that I very much liked in the book very early on, which actually signaled to me this was going to be a very different type of biography than I might have expected. And I think it speaks not only to this notion of sort of a grab bag of locations and of various narratives throughout, but also of his own identities. And I wanted to read this long list of possible Stefan Zweigs one could write a biography of. Stefan Zweig, very long dash, affluent Austrian citizen, restless wandering Jew, stupendously prolific author, tireless advocate for pan-European humanism, relentless networker, impeccable host, domestic hysteric, noble pacifist, cheap populist. I feel like I need to use a different tone of voice for every one of these. Squeamish sensualist, which I like very much. Dog lover, cat hater, book collector, alligator shoe wearer, which is nice. Dandy, depressive, cafe enthusiast, sympathizer with lonely hearts, casual womanizer, man ogler, suspected flasher, convicted fabulist. Convicted. Fawner over the powerful, champion of the powerless, abject coward before the ravages of old age, unblinking stoic before the mysteries of the grave. Stefan Zweig falls into the category of those who incarnate the enchantments and corruptions of their environment. And I'm wondering, are there times that you must be very challenged as a biographer if you've identified all these various aspects? Are there some that you feel tempted essentially to spend more time with and others that you don't? I assume that every biographer sort of invents their own particular object of their biography, but something that I very much appreciated in this was the way in which, following all these other strands of the politics, of the cultural politics that are taking place, I mean, you don't spare Zweig at all in the sense of the barbs that are thrown at him by the likes of Karl Kraus and others. In fact, one of the most compelling aspects I found were ways in which we know what other exiles were saying behind his back, and it's very well done. And so I'm curious about ways in which maybe this is always a challenge with Zweig, or with writing a biography, but somehow I imagine that doing this with Zweig, and given your interest in pulling out all the various personas that are part of this man, that must have added another level of difficulty to this project.
Well, it seemed really legitimate in his case because he'd been actually satirized. I think it was in the 1920s in a famous work that was kind of an encyclopedia of beasts portraying. It was portraits of different writers at the time, and Zweig was characterized as the Stef Zweig, who was this weird composite creature of all of these different literary animals. And Zweig repeatedly quotes this line from Nietzsche about every genius wears a mask. He was obsessed with masks as a particular Viennese temptation and also salvation. And he did have a remarkable ability, I think, to identify with an extraordinarily rich spectrum of individuals. This is what makes, for me, when his fiction really works, it works because of that incredible empathy, something that he tackles right on as a challenge in Beware of Pity in particular, where at the outset of his one completed novel, Zweig says there are two kinds of pity. There's a pity that's basically the kind of pity that we use to make the person appealing to us shut up and get away. Oh, I'm so sorry that you're so sick, goodbye. This kind of pity. And then he talks about this other kind of pity that demands an identification with the object of pity that can lead to the destruction of the person so empathizing because it's so intense. And I think Zweig did have this capacity and did feel it in himself as a peril that he would identify with people to the point that it would unravel him. It's one reason that increasingly the condition of exile, particularly in the big cities, became so difficult for him because he was an object of so much appeal. There were constantly people needing from him work and money and connections. And he was very, very generous. But the need was beyond anyone's ability to sate, and he was tortured by this, and it drove him. It was one of the things that made New York in particular an impossible place for him. But I think that what Zweig's multiplicity of personae offers us is almost a costume play of different, not just Viennese types, but European types of the era. We can study so many different manifestations of character types in him because he plays all these parts, and he plays them with real conviction. I don't think it can be underestimated how well he does this. And one thing in the book that I talk a lot about photographs, and Zweig was a person who was photographed incessantly, and his celebrity made this inevitable, and he clearly didn't dissuade it. But it's remarkable, and I've gone back since finishing the book and discovered new troves of photographs and find this again and again, that he really does have this ability, like the Zelig Woody Allen film, where in the different photographs he starts looking like the people he's with. It's uncanny, and I encourage people to go see this, because it's noticeable not only in Europe, but then when he goes to Brazil, he's standing among sort of cultural dignitaries in Bahia, and he starts having this swarthy skinned poses that's exactly like these gentlemen that he's with. And wherever he is, you feel how deeply he inserts himself in that milieu. Does that answer it all?
Yeah, it does, and actually, and it reminds
That's really
me,
fascinating.
Yeah.
And it brings up also, you talk about his ability to empathize in kind of an extraordinary, maybe almost all-encompassing way. And I wanted to ask you, André Breton has this great line about, I'm not sure what it was originally about, but it seems to me to apply so well to writing biography. He says, "Tell me who haunts you, I will tell you who you are." And of course, for you, you do such a great job of spelling out all of Zweig's contradictory personalities. And for you, there's a double wrinkle because, of course, Zweig also was a biographer. And I wondered how Zweig's empathy or lack thereof, or his approach to his own biographical subjects influenced you.
That's a great. I like very much how you put all that, and what a great quote from Breton. I remember another interview that Zweig gave in New York, in which he was queried about his choices of biographical subjects. And he spoke about how he didn't ever want to write about the victorious, because it seemed to him that the victorious in history were people who made others subject and the victims of their own convictions. His mission, as he saw it, was to write about those whose convictions had compelled them to acknowledge, if not defeat, at least a refusal to flourish if that flourishing meant the destruction of others. He was drawn to people who were often caught up in historical tides beyond their ken. It's one reason one of his most successful biographies, his biggest biography, I think, in the United States anyway, was the biography of Marie Antoinette. And he writes about her, he says, as a mediocre person, but he doesn't mean mediocre in a strictly pejorative sense. He's using the term to say she was an ordinary person, she was a girl. I mean, the movie by Sofia Coppola, I think she had read Zweig's Marie Antoinette, and certainly the way that Coppola presents her works with Zweig's portrait of her. She was a relatively ordinary young girl who finds herself the center of extraordinary events. And some nobility emerges when she is tested by these terrible, terrible upheavals. The irony that I found again and again with Zweig is that when he sets out these manifestos for what he's doing with his biographies, clearly they apply to himself as well. And he wrote that biography. It was published in 1932. So this is 1 year, less than 1 year, in fact, because I think it was published, at least in English, in November of 1932, when he is about to be tested and tried by upheavals at least matching those to which Marie Antoinette was subject. And there is this uncanny foreshadowing in his work. He saw himself as someone who was a wonderful prophet of the future. In fact, I don't think he was particularly accurate when he prognosticated about world history. I use a phrase in the book that he has the luck of the gambler who always bets on black. He always thinks it's going to get bad, and it didn't always go that way. But when it came to inscribing in the stories that he chose to focus on, these strange lineaments of what was to become his own future destiny, it is a bit strange.
I think you even say that about his biography of Erasmus, that he describes it as a thinly veiled self-portrait.
He uses that term, yeah. I mean, one thing, I want to actually linger for 1 second, because that's a remarkable work that I encourage people to look at. This biography he wrote when at the very outset of his exile, and he does parallel himself. He doesn't parallel himself with Erasmus's greatness, but he says the Erasmian sensibility is his own, and by that he means someone who is helplessly and forever a conciliator. He uses this phrase about the difficulty of being in the no man's land between the trenches. At one point he writes to a friend that, I refuse to be the hammer and I will not be the anvil. He sees him, he says, I can only work from the connective. And Erasmus he saw in precisely this way, who he sets up against Luther as a sort of allegorical, demagogic parallel with Hitler. This got him into trouble with various people, including Thomas Mann, who didn't think that Hitler should be ennobled by that comparison. But Zweig manages in this biography, he does one thing that's remarkable. The most important, I think, or the strongest critique ever written of Stefan Zweig is by Hannah Arendt. And it's a review or an essay about his memoir that comes out the year after his death in 1943. She writes it for the Aufbau. And it's very, very sharp and very, very, what's the word? I mean, successfully condemning of what she saw as Zweig's inability to have mingled with the people and to have seen what was really going on in the streets. He lived with this elite group of humanists, and if they'd only gone down and looked at what was happening with the unemployment, etc., they might have been able to intercede more effectively than they did. But what's remarkable is in this Erasmus biography, which was written 9 years before Arendt's critique, which came 1 year after Zweig's death, he says he makes exactly this critique about the humanists. And in fact, I think he was less guilty than Erasmus and less guilty than Arendt makes him out to be. But he says that they were wonderful, but they invested much too much in Bildung, in education, that they staked everything on that, which is exactly what Zweig really believed in the end, that what you had to do. He was identified with the Social Democrat Party, which was very strong in Austria in the intra-war period. He was identified with the progressive left, but he didn't really enter into the economics of it very much outside of this extraordinary personal generosity. What he did do was to take part in various efforts to educate the working classes, and he really committed a great deal of time and effort in that, and he completely believed in the ability of every person to enlighten themselves and raise themselves to a higher cultural sphere by the force of their own minds. He was not at all a snob in this way. And I think he should be respected for how much he gave, but it is exactly the flaw that he said doomed Erasmus and, in some extent, perhaps doomed himself.
It's interesting. I know that many of the questions you've received about Stefan Zweig in the last weeks, months, have revolved around this question of, well, what is it that makes Stefan Zweig relevant? My sense is, and it seems like you'll be talking about this later today, is you've positioned him as a type of public intellectual, I mean, to use the language of the present. And I certainly noticed one thing that I found myself tweeting this weekend before I saw these interviews in which you talked about social media was, before there was Twitter, there was Stefan Zweig, because I found these, just a language you were using of it in a description of the type of very important role he had in terms of connecting people, but in some ways also a similar criticism perhaps of, well, he's doing many things, but without the depth that he needs to do them, or without the kind of commitment he needs to have, or at one point, I think you're paraphrasing Karl Kraus about the dangers of, what is it, drowning in the shallowness of his sentences. I wonder, I know that you'll say more about this later today, but maybe you give us just some preview of how it is that we can think of Zweig in those terms of a public intellectual, and does he also come with some sort of, I mean, based on what you were just talking about, a certain warning about pitfalls of that position as well?
Thanks. You know, in his official suicide note, when Zweig says that the time has come for him to essentially to renounce life, he does so on the basis of having reached a point as a person for whom personal freedom was always the highest good and intellectual labor the greatest joy. And I think the way that Zweig was a public intellectual that resonates particularly for me now is exactly on those two channels. Personal freedom and intellectual labor as a joyous thing. I don't think that I think that we can get beyond traditional political categories and say that we feel threatened. I think as a society, those of us who care about those, whatever personal freedom is, it's a time where many people feel concerned that it's eroding, and intellectual labor is, in a literal Marxian economic sense, it is certainly devalued right now. There's no question, but that it is demonetized in many, many places where it wasn't, even just a few years ago. I think that this crisis is very much before us, and Zweig thought intensely and sometimes very eloquently about why personal freedom mattered so much. For him, it really begins to stop when you have to begin using a passport to travel. This was a problem for him already by the middle of the First World War, what it meant to carry documentation, but he returns to it obsessively in the subsequent years, in the last years of his life. He talks about the ways in which we are reduced to these official forms, that if, you know, he says in one letter, he says, I cannot identify with the me of my passport. And yet, increasingly, the me of his passport is the only one that will be recognized by the people with whom he has to deal. certainly now, whatever giant bureaucracy one wants to refer to, we are often finding ourselves reduced to those very reductive constructs that can fit within an official form. Something is at risk. And it's not just about geographical mobility and what that must have been like. He beautifully rhapsodizes about what it meant to just get up and decide you want to go somewhere. And you just got on a train and went. Now, there was an economic freedom that he had that wasn't obviously shared by everyone. But, you could also walk across borders, and it wasn't a big deal. But beyond geographical mobility, he saw the idea of individuality itself under siege. And he saw it as under siege due to not only the totalitarian governments that had taken hold by the time that he went into exile, but before that, even in the 20s, he wrote this remarkable, very forceful essay called The Monotonization of the World, which is an essay about really blaming America for what he sees as these different mass cultural phenomenon. What does it mean, he asks, when everyone is wearing the same fashion everywhere in the world and watching the same movies and at the same moment dancing to the same songs? What kind of reduction of the beautiful idiosyncrasy of human possibility occurs when we are subject to these uniform expressions of culture? And this comes in a way back to your question about the different persona that Zweig himself embodied. He was so concerned with and so in love with and so unprejudiced against all the different little micro-local cultures that the world presented when he was a young person. He loved just wandering the streets of different cities and in different places and meeting people and talking with them and soaking up what he could of, to use a crude term, local color. And I think he saw that color, that palette, going very, very dark, even before the ascendancy of National Socialism.
Yeah, and of course, what you say about freedom and his love of freedom and personal mobility, I think, is especially poignant in light of his last novel, the chess novella, it's called in German. I think in English it's called The Royal Game. And if you haven't read Zweig, it's really a wonderful place to start, although extremely bleak, which is about a man who's literally, physically in prison and seeks escape, mental release, and intellectual stimulation in the game of chess. And of course, it doesn't really provide him any release at all, and he winds up torturing himself insane with his own thoughts.
Yeah, I agree that, to me, it's my favorite of all the novellas, and it's sad that when he wrote it, he felt that he was completely spent as a creative artist. He took no joy in writing. He said, he kept saying, I have no pep. So he didn't believe, without this pep that was so important to him, he didn't believe what he was making was good, but it's amazing. And to Ruth's point, one element of this story, which involves someone who's, the only story in which he tackled the events of the 30s head on. It's about someone who was Viennese from a very cultured family, a lawyer who ends up in a concentration camp. But the abuse of this concentration camp is actually just the total deprivation of all stimuli. He can't have books, he can't have anything at all. So his imagination, in a way that I think also can be looked at allegorically for something that might have happened to Vienna itself as a city, his imagination ends up so overtaking the real world that he gets this, he finally gets this little book of chess matches and plays them and becomes kind of a brilliant chess player. But he becomes able to actually divide his consciousness in two and play against himself. And the story, I won't give it all away, but he ends up then having an actual match that goes horribly wrong because of how developed, how hypertrophied his imagination actually is. So yeah, that's a great one to start. I want to make sure, I want to just ask Ruth one question, because I know you are in the midst of making a biography, and I want to know, are there literary pilgrimages, or what are the ways that you're finding yourself drawn, inspired to conjure her or her world? I mean, what are what are the real biographer's keys that you're discovering in what you're doing?
I feel that I should ask you that question since you're the one who's actually made a biography, and I'm still in the process. The way you put it, I feel sort of like an ostrich trying to lay one of those giant eggs. But we talked a little earlier about how obsessiveness seems to be the hallmark of all biographers, and I certainly feel myself becoming victim to that. In terms of the pilgrimages, I do think it's easy to romanticize the places that our heroes grew up. The streets they walked on. Yesterday, I happened to walk past the Macy's headquarters on 34th Street and remembered that Shirley Jackson, my subject, published her first piece in the New Republic about her Christmas season selling books at Macy's back when they actually had a books department. So if you obsess about it too much, it is possible to find these things in so many different places. But I do think that there is a value in seeing the actual physical place that your subject the places that were important to your subject. And that kind of became clear to me last year. I went to California and visited a suburb of San Francisco called Burlingame, which is where Jackson spent some of her formative childhood years. And she fictionalized it in her first novel, which is called The Road Through the Wall, and it's kind of a dark suburban tale about neighbors who are all very gossipy and living, spying on each other's lives and kind of the havoc they wreak with their lack of interest basically in anything other than each other's personal lives. And one thing I noticed when I actually visited Burlingame was that the houses are really close together. Like almost so that you could lean out the window and shake your neighbor's hand. And that really crystallized for me the kind of claustrophobic coziness that Jackson wrote about in that book.
Yeah, those discoveries where something is physicalized that you have as an idea, I think those are the richest moments. That's very vivid.
Can we pause here for questions?
You very cleverly, in your response, weave the books that Zweig wrote that were really very much a mirror who he was. You talk about Erasmus, you talk about that moment in Marie Antoinette's life that had some resonance with his own situation. You spoke of the chess game, the royal game, which of course, again, somehow seems to turn into a beautiful story, something that was actually cooking in his mind. But what neither of you have mentioned, and which is to me the biggest puzzle of all, is that Zweig was I wouldn't call him a romance novelist, but he was a very, very prolific, successful. In our world, I've learned a word that's very hard for me to remember, but it's called, I think in publishing, upmarket commercial. It took me a long time to remember it. I'm very fast, I have to tell you. Upmarket. So he was very much upmarket commercial. Now, I'm not even sure how upmarket he was, but millions and millions and millions of stories that he wrote beautifully, to the great contempt of a lot of his friends who were like Joseph Roth and others, were much more, sophisticated and hard to read, and he was easy, and everybody could read him, and he's still in France and in Italy and Germany in airports. So, and then I would even say something a little mean, which is that George had an extraordinary reception among reviews. Everybody's raving about his book, but some more meanly than others, some very kindly, some a little bit less kindly, says, why didn't talk about all his books? Well, of course, he spoke about Erasmus, he spoke about all these books that you're talking about now. But there is something a little bit, I would say, schizophrenic about the Zweig you guys are presenting, the Zweig we are learning to know through the biography, and the romance novels, and his extraordinary ability to go inside a woman's head and really somehow elaborate about love troubles and this systematic thing women seem to do and men to imagine a love story that they know very well is going to fail. It seems that that's why they're going after it. So I'm just curious how you feel about this other side of Zweig that's somehow a little bit absent from conversation.
You know, the question of how to write about his fiction within the kind of book that I was writing was something I definitely gave a lot of thought to, and I do spend time on the ways that he the interiority of women in particular, but of all of his characters, the richness of that, and I do try to look at why his stories worked so well, but I don't spend too much time, and there are a few different explanations for that. First of all, I honestly do believe that it was important for me to try to make him interesting. That is really a lot to show why he so had fascinated me. I was convinced I didn't need to lead people by the hand to his books if the book that I wanted to write. But no, I think I have a way into what you're saying. If what I was doing would work, it would be natural that there would be intrigue. But in terms of the way his capacity for, I mean, your term, romance writing, I think this gets back to these issues of empathy that Eric had raised early on. I know someone whose father was Zweig's banker in England, and whose mother went to live with him for a time when he was in Bath, which was the town that Zweig bought a home in, the last place that he owned in anything like Europe. And she spoke, apparently, about her expectations for meeting Zweig. She thought she was going to meet this, essentially a hipster bohemian. And she was shocked when, in fact, he was buttoned up, so formal. His manners were so stiff, and his facade was so unrevealing. I really came to feel that one of the ways that Zweig's fiction works so well, and this partly comes from his intense study of Freud, who I think certainly no one before him, read Freud almost prescriptively as an artist, like he did. And when you read his long monograph on Freud, it's clear he's thinking, how am I going to apply all this to the kind of fiction I'm going to make? What can we do with this idea of the unconscious as artists? Consciously apply the unconscious to characters. Well, one thing that Zweig definitely did was he was willing to grant people whose facades might be extremely unrevealing, undemonstrative, the ordinary lives that he also turned into his biographical subjects. He said, no, I know that you too have this symphonically rich inner life. He was extremely persuasive and I think quite generous and graceful in his granting to shop girls and people from all sorts of ordinary walks of life the richness of fantasy life that might be identified only with the great heroes of a classic 19th century novel. He said everybody has those. And I think people looked, when they began to discover his fiction, and it began to be when it really swept like wildfire, quite to his own surprise, by the way. Zweig always and convincingly speaks about his own inability really to believe how successful he is. Although he attributes it, slight digression, he attributes it, the one time he analyzes it in his memoir, he says, I attribute it to what's in fact a radical character flaw, which is my incredible impatience. He says, I get so bored even by the great works of literature, so I cut and I cut and I cut. And certainly his stories are very, very streamlined. But I think it was this idea that all of us can have an opera inside of us that was very, very fertile for readers from all different walks of life and remains really something quite wonderful. And particularly, as Judith said, his sensitivity to the inner lives of women, which had not been granted, if they'd been granted romantic yearnings, they hadn't been granted depth. And he really gave them depth on top of the romance. Is that?
Interesting also because you're a little bit hard on the way he treats his wife in the book, the second wife.
Yes. I am a bit hard. I really came to feel with her to some extent. Her family had almost all made it out of Germany to England, and Zweig drags her all over the world with him. She was 30 years younger, 33 at the time of their death, and suddenly she's just in this tiny little Brazilian town, and I came to see his suicide as inevitable, but Lotta, his second wife's suicide, seemed to me very difficult to come to grips with as an idea. She might have had another life. And their love was real, I'm convinced of that, and I think that in some way that was clearly what made her make the decision to join him in his suicide, but also just the impossibility of trying to think your way back over all the borders they'd crossed at that point in February 1942, what it would have meant to retreat. It must have just been so daunting for someone without his spectrum of connections. And so, yeah, I felt sorry for her.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the forces that compelled Zweig to leave Europe, and also why someone that brilliant, that admired, saw no other way out at the end except to take his own life.
Well, starting with your second question, I mean, I don't think, when you read his letters and his memoir, the mystery of his suicide ceases to be very mysterious. He had been depressed for a long time. He was probably a depressive even before things went badly. But he had lost so many friends, and so many of his ideals he saw as shattered beyond repair. And it's important to add to that, he did not think that the Nazis were going to triumph. And he's very careful to say over and over that another time will come. But he also writes, I'm 60 years old. I can't start my life again. I can't do it. I've had to start my life over and over. He was tired. And there was a language thing as well. He was a polyglot, but Portuguese was hard for him. And I think as much as he loved Brazil, and he did, and the weird thing about reading his official suicide note is how much of it reads almost like some kind of, like he's receiving a literary prize. The beginning of it is, I want to thank Brazil, and every day I'm, it's really like that. Every day I'm happier here. I mean, and it would have been so great if I could have started anywhere, it would have been here. And it's quite also beautiful and moving that he chooses to make this gesture of thanks to Brazil in his last hours of his life. But he was despairing, and he knew that a new Europe would arise. But he writes by the end over and over about feeling he's living a posthumous existence and feeling there's nothing he can do but be a spectator, that his hour on the stage is over. But he was driven to leave Europe. I mean, he was, ultimately he couldn't have gone back to Austria without being arrested. There is a bit of mystery as to why he left England. And I have a chapter about that because, things were not so bad for him there. He had a quite lovely house. But he writes at one point also, he says, nowhere in the world do I feel more isolated than here, he wrote a friend, than in England. He didn't like England. I mean, he thought it was dreary. And in fact, up until the fall of France, he was hopping across the channel for, as he put it, a touch of Latin gaiety. He found the English, for a while he's so impressed with their sobriety, and he knows it's much better than the intemperate, febrile Viennese psychology. He's like, this is amazing. War is being declared and everyone's just going about their business. It's incredible. And there's this first days of his diary, he's just marveling. And then he's, I can do this too. It's great. I wasn't like this at the start of the First World War. How wonderful. I am also being calm. And then 3 days later, I mean, literally, it's less than a week. He's like, but it's so dark at night. How are we going to get through this? It can't last 3 months. And then in a remarkable twist, all of these things he's been lauding about the English cool. He really starts saying, when this was happening in Vienna, there were balls and there were parties and there was, and where's all that life? And he just felt, it wasn't, the English way was not something he was going to warm to. And they didn't particularly warm to him, it should be added. And I spent some time in Bath and spoke to the very lovely family who now live in his house. And the woman who lived there, who had become obsessed with Zweig after moving in, she started saying, he would have found it. She was a lifelong from a family who'd lived in Bath for a couple of generations, and she just said it's so snobby, and he would never have been accepted here. Now, I don't think Zweig cared too much about being cut out by the nobles. That was never his problem, but I do think it was claustrophobic.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the status of historical biography in this time period. I know that Zweig was one of the most, if not the most, translated author into English of his generation, of the German language authors. Was there something in particular about this genre that international readers found so appealing at this time, do you think?
That's a good question. And I think it gets back to the strengths of Zweig as a storyteller. He does, what we would now call, I guess, creative nonfiction, that term I never quite get my arms all the way around, but they read like narrative adventures. His biographies don't spend a lot of time on analysis. But at the same time, I have to say, I was speaking with someone not long ago who had done academic work on both, on Marie Antoinette, certainly, and they said, actually, it's pretty great how many different possibilities he raised. So he speculated intelligently, and he plunged you into dramatic moments in his biographical subjects' stories. So they read a bit like potboilers. Mary Stuart is also, it was also an enormous success, and the same thing. I think they have a sort of cinematic quality at their best, and in fact, the film. There was an MGM film made of the Marie Antoinette that was, I think, the most lavish production of the 1930s, or one of two or three, and it was enormously successful, starring Norma Shearer, and that was really straight from his biography. So, like, in the same way that many of his novellas suited themselves to cinematic adaptation so well, I think he knew how to really whittle down the story to the moments that were going to capture the hearts of his readers. And he reduced, he was also critiqued for this, that he reduced these large historical forces to essentially individual psychological problems. But I think he got inside the heads of his characters quite successfully, and if he missed the full imbrication of historical themes that might have informed those psychologies, you get the feeling of someone alive when you read his biographies. But you're right to point that out. They were hugely popular here. They're a little hard to read now. They feel that the style is dated. But I think also translations in this case are partly to blame.
That's going to be our last question. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, George.
Well, thank you, Eric and Ruth, for giving such great questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you.